Okay, guys, here we are again, chapter 6, the memory chapter. I just wanted to mention before we get started that this is Monday morning, March 16th, and I just saw an email this morning indicating that there's a possibility if the coronavirus scare kind of passes substantially or somewhat by the end of the semester that we may go back to non-remote learning. And I've already registered my complaint with our leadership here that I can't imagine doing that, expect us as faculty and you as students to go and shift gears twice in a major way during the same semester is asking too much. So we were initially told that once we made the shift, we would stay that way through the rest of the semester, but now they're starting to back off that a little bit. I'm not sure exactly why. I think there's just been a lot of dissension on both sides, a lot of conflict, a lot of miscommunication, and we're still trying to sort it all out. So anyway, who knows what's going to happen, but my plan is to keep going this way for the rest of the semester. Before I get started today, I also wanted to mention that with my extra time, the time that my family and I have this past weekend, especially since it was raining, we saw 2 good movies on Redbox, which is the only way we can afford to go to the movies, and probably these days, and probably it's a good idea not to go to the theater these days anyway, but we saw Jojo Rabbit, which good movie I think, and Knives Out. So anyway, Jojo Rabbit I think is relevant to the chapter 9, the development chapter. It's kind of an allegory of what it was like to be a young person growing up in Nazi Germany, where you have the pressures of going with the flow, all the conformity going on to put pressure on people to become Nazi youth, the young kids to become Nazi youth, and the whole country to follow in the footsteps of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. And then you have the natural rebellious reactance side of people where they want to do their own thing, they want to do what they feel comfortable with, and they want to rebel against authority. So that was kind of epitomized in the 10, 11-year-old boy in the movie. Anyway, I thought it was a pretty good movie, and it's not only about Nazi Germany. I think it's about a lot of growing up as an adolescent, as a young person, and having to deal with the pressures to be something that you're really not. I also want to mention that Knives Out was not the same kind of movie, and it wasn't really an allegory with a message, other than that family members can be pretty stupid sometimes, and the dynamics in family can be pretty crazy. I just thought it was a really good movie. So if you haven't seen either of those movies, I would recommend them on some of these days where you're pent up with nothing else to do because you can't go outside and get within 6 feet of anybody else. All right, so chapter 6 is about memory. Kind of a fun chapter, I think. Basically, I think the practical idea of this chapter is that when you understand memory better, when you understand how it works, then you have a better ability to make it work in your favor. So people who have really, really good memories, oftentimes they're not necessarily smarter than you. They just have a better understanding for what to do to make things stick. So I think there's a practical benefit in that way in this chapter, through this chapter, as you learn how memory works. Now, the way that we traditionally study memory and teach it, describe it, is by virtue or through the 3 stages model. All right, so the 3-stage model basically says, that's not very clear, is it? The 3-stage model says that there's the first stage of memory, which is called sensory register memory, which basically is the sensation part of memory. We sense something, bring it into our sensory system, our nervous system, and then we put it into the short-term memory of consciousness, where we can process it, pay attention to it, and maybe process it enough to get it into the 3rd stage of memory, the long-term memory stage. the three-stage model of memory is pretty sequential. It says sensory register memory occurs, then it stops, and then short-term memory begins, and then it stops, and then long-term memory begins. So in a sense, when we're trying to remember something long-term, we go stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, but it doesn't really stop there. It also suggests that for most memories, and we're talking about conscious memories, you have to then put it back from stage 3 back into stage 2 in order to be able to use it. So if you're studying information for a test, you read it, you hear it, you put it into your conscious short-term memory stage, then you think about it and process it enough to put it away in the file cabinet of long-term memory. But when it comes time to take the test, if it stays in the file cabinet of long-term memory, it's not going to help you out. You need to be able to put it back into consciousness. You need to be able to put it back there so that you can think about it some more to be able to answer the questions on the test. Now, some people have argued that this three-stage model of memory is too simplistic, and it's kind of simplistic in the way that the way we teach the brain is kind of simplistic. So we say that in the occipital lobe is where we see, the temporal lobe is where we hear, of course, touch sensations in the parietal lobe, and frontal lobe is motor cortex and other things. But of course, the brain is far more complex than that and far more integrated than that sort of kind of categorization of the brain parts kind of suggests. So similarly, it's probably the case that it's hard to know when sensory memory ends and short-term memory begins, and where short-term memory ends and when long-term memory begins. We're probably doing a lot of parallel processing instead of just sequential processing in long-term in memory. Okay, with that kind of a background, let's get into another idea here. Some people will say, okay, with the flaws of the three-stage model of memory, we need to remember that there's a basic process that's probably more fundamental than anything else to memory. And that is that the more you process something, the more you go out the x-axis here, the more you process something, the more likely you're going to move up the y-axis to be able to remember things. There's really no substitute for processing. The more you process something, the more you're going to remember it long term. The less you process it, the more likely it's going to be forgotten long term. So if we were to superimpose you're really going to have to follow along on your PowerPoint presentation to be able to see this, to put this together with the PowerPoint presentation, because you're going to have a hard time seeing it on the screen here, I can tell. But if you superimpose sensory register memory on this graph of processing and memory, what you can see is that sensory register memory really pertains to a very small part of this graph. It represents a little bit of processing and not very much memory benefit. But you have to be able to sense things first to be able to kind of start the process. So it's important, but it doesn't get you very far up the scale of being able to remember things. Short-term memory gets you a little further up the scale. So when you process things a little more than simply just paying attention to them, then you're going to be conscious of these things you're trying to remember. It's going to be in short-term memory. If you process things a little more, then you start to move into long-term memory. And note that long-term memory is huge. It includes the memories you processed enough to get into long-term memory today, or even maybe for this half of this day. But because you didn't process it to a huge amount, it's probably going to be gone within a short amount of time, maybe within the same day, maybe within a few days or weeks. Not all long-term memories are equal. Some people want to believe that everything you've ever sensed, you're going to be able to remember long-term if you could just figure out a way to retrieve it. But this model basically suggests that that can't be true. There's going to be a lot of long-term memories you just haven't processed enough to be able to create the sticking power of memories that are going to last a long, long, long time, maybe even a lifetime. So these memories way out here, the reason why they're out there is because they've been processed to a great extent. And they've likely been processed to a great extent because they're hugely meaningful, maybe emotionally meaningful, or surprising, or traumatically meaningful in some way that they just kind of stick because of all the biochemistry involved in processing those kinds of meaningful memories. Plus, there's also, take 9/11, for instance. If you can make this out, there's a picture of the airplane flying into the Twin Towers in New York City on September 11, 2001. That's not only a highly meaningful, significantly emotionally significant memory, but it's also a memory that's been processed to a great extent. It gets talked about in a class like this. You've talked about it with your friends, with your parents, in history classes. It just gets processed again and again and again, and so it's more likely to stick. So this is an example of what we call a flashbulb memory. It's as if this one event gets so indelibly imprinted in your mind that it's as if a flashbulb went off when this event occurred, and it tied in everything you were feeling, where you were, who you were with, everything you were sensing when you learned of this, at least initially you learned of this experience. Now, I just want to point out that flashbulb memories, while they are a good example of highly processed memories, and that teaches us something, some research has shown that flashbulb memories are also subject to error. Memory, as you'll learn in the chapter, and we may get a chance to talk a little bit about today, is always being edited. So you're editing your memories based on what you know now, and in general, what you have experienced since the time of initially experiencing that event. So oftentimes the details of even flashbulb memories, which seem pretty clear to us, can be erroneous. They can be messed up in some way. However, flashbulb memories still, I think, represent memories that are highly processed and a good example of how memory really works. The more you process something, the more you're going to remember it long term. And I think the basic lesson is, if you want to remember that material for the next test you have in school, as well as you remember that highly processed, significant memory of your childhood or many years back, whether it's 9/11 or something like that. If you want to remember the academic material as well as that stuff, then you need to process the academic material as much as you process that stuff. And if you do that, you're probably kind of weird. There's something unusual about you, because for most of us, this academic material you're studying now is not as important as 9/11 or when you found out, sorry for this, some of you, when your mom or dad died, or your mom and dad were getting a divorce, or you had your first sexual experience or something like that. Those are much more meaningful, much more personal for you, and so they get processed a lot more and they stick a lot better. But the simple rule still exists that if you could process something else, like an academic material, bunch of material in a class, if you can process that as much as you process this other meaningful material, if you could make this other material as meaningful as that, then this would stick as well as that. Anyway, let's talk about sensory register memory a little more specifically. We could say that it occurs in the senses. It actually just represents sensation. So a lot of times we think of memory as strictly a brain process, but it's not entirely. Ultimately, that's where it needs to be for it to work for us long term, but it starts in our sensory system. So every sense has its own register. So there's a taste sensory register, touch sensory register, smell sensory register, as well as vision and audition sensory register. Whoops. So every sense has its own gateway into short-term memory. Two examples of sensory register memory do include vision and the vision and audition version of these memories. So there's visual sensory memory, which we also can call iconic memory, and auditory sensory memory, which we can call echoic memory. I kind of like the words iconic and echoic because those words suggest kind of the representation of the memory in this stage. It appears there's an icon of whatever you've just seen lingering in your retina for as long as it takes your retina to encode, transduce, and send that information onto your brain. So in chapter 3, we talked about how sensation is encoding, transducing, and sending. Well, it takes time. There's a process involved. And apparently, while that's going on, there's an icon of what you just saw that's lingering in your retina. Even if the thing is taken away from your vision, there's a lingering image icon of that thing you just saw in your retina. And the same thing is true with echoic memory. When you hear something, even if the sound is gone, it takes a little bit of time for it to be processed in your cochlea. And as long as it is there, then you can kind of still hear that echo. It turns out that the echo lingers long enough that you can actually be conscious of it at some time. So I'm sure you probably have had the experience of hearing somebody say something, but maybe you weren't really paying attention, so you didn't quite catch it, but you know they said something, so you say, what? What did you say? Could you repeat that? And maybe while you're actually saying that, you can hear the echo lingering in your cochlea, and you answer your own question. You don't have to have the person repeat it at that point because it's kind of still there. So let me mention that in this whole discussion of these 3 stages of memory, there are 2 broad concepts that are going to come up. I'm going to want you to know about. One is the capacity of each one of these stages, which is how much information can fit in each one of these stages. And the second one is the duration of these stages. So how long do they last, duration, and how much can fit into each one of these stages. So let's take a look at sensory memory in general. What do you think the capacity of short sensory register memory is? Is it large, is it medium, or is it small? Well, I just want to point out to you that mostly we would say that the capacity for sensory register memory is huge. If you think about vision, for instance, if I'm looking at that picture behind my monitor here, picture of the Queen's soldiers marching down the mall in front of Buckingham Palace, I may be looking directly at that, but the fact is that my peripheral vision is way out here, and my eyes are receiving light, and transducing information about that light that's being reflected off of everything between over here and all the way over here, even if I'm focusing on right there, right? So the amount of information that is being sent to my brain from my eyes is huge. Using that as an example, in general, we could say that the capacity for sensory memory is limited only by the ability of our eyes to be able to, or ears to take in light, sound, or whatever it is, based on our physical perspective, if we're generally looking over here or over here or wherever. You can kind of, getting a sense of that, you can kind of get a sense of why the idea that some people have that anything you've ever sensed could be possible to be remembered long term if you just found the right retrieval cue doesn't make any sense. Basically, 99.9% of all of the information that gets taken in through our sensory systems is stuff that we don't pay attention to and that we don't need to pay attention to in order to get by. So it kind of doesn't even register. I mean, it goes through our brain, but it doesn't register beyond that, and it's gone. Okay, so what about duration? How long does information stay in sensory memory? Well, it turns out to be it's a pretty short time. So the capacity is huge, but the duration is pretty short. And it differs between visual and sensory and auditory sensory memory. So for visual sensory memory, we would say that it lasts about half a second to 3/4 of a second. If I look at that image again behind my screen and look away for a half a second to 3/4 of a second, there's a little icon representing that image on my retina. And if I could focus on it in that half a second to 3/4 of a second, I could still acknowledge that I'm seeing it, even though it's gone. In terms of audition, however, the duration is 3 to 4 seconds. So 6 to 8 times longer, we'll say. That's long enough for us to be able to acknowledge or be aware of the fact that that echo is still lingering in our cochlea for a certain amount of time after the sound is gone. Now, we don't know much about the sensory register memories for touch, taste, and smell, but they likely work the same way, and their duration is probably going to be like visual sensory memory, not very long, but the capacity can also be huge. We know the most about vision and audition sensory memory likely because those are our two major senses as humans. All right, let's take a look at something else related to sensory register memory. This is called eidetic memory. I'm sure you've heard of photographic memory. Maybe you haven't heard of the term eidetic memory, but you've heard of photographic memory. So I'm trying to get you to realize that photographic memory and eidetic memory can be used interchangeably and have been by psychologists. So this is a term like subliminal messages, as we talked about a little bit ago. It's kind of misunderstood by a lot of people. Some people will brag that they have a photographic memory, but it's highly unlikely that they have a truly photographic memory in the way that I'm going to describe it here, which is a way that many psychologists describe it. So the way that I'm going to describe it here is photographic memory is an iconic memory. It's an extra long iconic memory. So remember, iconic memory lasts about half a second after you see something and move away from it. The icon lingers there for half a second. But if you have a photographic memory, after you see something, when it's taken away, that icon may linger for 30 seconds or a couple of minutes, but usually not very long beyond that. Sometimes people talk about photographic memory as lasting weeks or months or years, but that's probably not a true photographic memory in terms of the way that many psychologists describe it. It's really just a long-term memory, which is in the third stage of memory, not the first stage of memory. So some people actually do have iconic memories. Many of us had everybody has iconic memories, but some people actually do have true eidetic and photographic memories. But most of us who had this at a very young age, we outgrow it. And the reason for that is because this is a type of memory that doesn't involve the brain, and therefore it's not very helpful. In order to remember things really long-term and have them be useful, we have to be able to process them in the brain, be able to think about them and process them in major ways. And iconic memories don't allow us to do that because they exist in our sensory system. Let's take a look at the way that some psychologists have studied eidetic memory or photographic memory. So this is hard to see, but this is an image of a young girl like Alice in Wonderland looking up at a tree and seeing a cat in the tree. So this picture would be shown to a patient or a subject. The picture would be taken away, and then the researcher would ask, okay, now how many black stripes in the cat's tail? And you're not really, if you're being asked this question, the idea is not that you're trying to recall it out of your short-term memory or long-term memory, but can you still actually just see it? And in a sense, count the stripes. Go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then report accurately how many stripes there are. And just to test more thoroughly whether the person truly has eidetic memory, other questions are asked. Okay, you saw some leaves down in the lower right-hand corner of the picture. There were some big leaves and some smaller leaves. So how many big leaves? How many smaller leaves? And there were 2 apron strings on Alice's dress and apron. Which one was longer, the one on the right or the one on the left? And there may be other questions that the researcher would ask of the person to see if they're really able to hold on to this image in their retina for a longer period than most people, for half a second or so. And some are able to hold on to it. Ironically, you might think they would have better memories. The research says that these people don't have better memories at all because, like the rest of us, they still need to be able to put it in their brain to be able to process it. And true photographic memory doesn't really help them to do that. You could argue, reflecting back on Piaget, you could argue that all kids in a sense have a photographic memory that as their brain develops, they slowly lose. So this photographic memory that all children have when they're really just thinking, not with their minds. Remember, Piaget believed that kids don't think with their minds, they think with their senses early on. They lose that ability as their mind develops, as their brain develops. If you've ever tried to play memory, the game of memory with a very young child, where you have all these cards face down on a table, and there's matches, there's pairs in the arrangement of cards, and you're supposed to turn them over one by one and find the matches, and you take turns. If you've ever played that with a 3-year-old child and you haven't been at the top of your game and not really motivated, you might have been beaten by a 3-year-old child because they have amazing kind of sensory memories. In a sense, they have a better ability to remember trivial things even without processing all the meaningful relationships between those and other things, because their mind isn't developed to the point that it kind of gets in the way of their sensory ability. So the next time somebody tells you they have a photographic memory, you can maybe say something like, well, that's too bad. I guess that kind of suggests your brain hasn't developed normally so that you can use that in memory. That's maybe, you could get some help with that. I don't know. Maybe that's not the most appropriate approach, but a true photographic memory has not really been shown to be a really good thing for people beyond childhood. And so, anyway, we probably don't use that term correctly. So there's the picture again. Right apron string longer, 2 big leaves, 7 or 8 black stripes on the cat's tail. All right, let's look at short-term memory. Short-term memory is the first stage of memory that occurs in the brain. So it occurs in the brain. Attention is what determines whether things get into short-term memory. In fact, the only thing you need to do to move something from sensory register memory to short-term memory is to pay attention to it. And again, most things that we sense we don't pay any attention to, so most things don't go from first base to second base. Short-term memory, the way we've been describing it, basically is consciousness. If you pay attention to something, you're putting it into consciousness. In a sense, it's like a table. When you pay attention to something and put it into consciousness, you're putting it on that table. And as long as it's on that table, you can think about it, you can process it to as much extent as you're cognitively capable of. And if you process it well enough, in a meaningful enough way, you're able to move it from that memory table to the file cabinet of long-term memory. Anyway, this is what the table might look like. You put items on that table. And as the picture suggests, that table is going to have a limited capacity. And maybe not as easily seen from the image here, it's likely going to have a limited duration. Putting things on the table, once you put things on the table, they're likely only going to stay there for a short amount of time. So there's going to be a limited capacity and a limited duration. But let's take a look at the capacity for a second. And this is going to be a little bit different since we're not in class and we can't do it synchronously, dynamically in class. But I'm going to read to you some digit spans, several of them, and I'll read a short one first and then a slightly longer one and then a slightly longer one, and after each one your job will be to see if you can remember each one. So, and we want to, as the strings get progressively longer, we want to see how long the string is before you really have a hard time remembering the string in its entirety. So the way to do this, I guess, is I'll read out a string first of 5 digits. And just listen to it, and then when I say go at the end, you're to write them down, and later on we'll test you to see if you got all 5 of them. And then we'll do it again with 6 digits, and then 7 digits, and then 8 digits, and then 9 digits, and we'll see if you can remember those. So don't write anything down until I say go. So here's the first string. 1, 9, 4, 2, 7, go. All right, you can actually pause this for a second if you're trying to remember that. And then if you've unpaused it, or if you're ready, I'm going to give you the next string. Again, when I get all done, I'll say go, and then you see if you can write it down. Next string, 9, 1, 9, 2, 5, 8, go. Okay, third string, 9, 8, 2, 2, 9, 3, 1, go. All right, here's the fourth string. 3, 8, 5, 4, 9, 6, 5, 7, go. Okay, let's try another one. Fifth string. 5, 7, 0, 4, 7, 1, 3, 6, 9, go. Okay, just for laughs, we'll do another one. Here we go. 5, 8, 2, 1, 9, 6, 1, 2, 1, 6, go. All right. Maybe you pause this in between. That's fine. I'm going to read them back to you. If you got 19427 for the first one, you were correct. Most of you should have gotten that one. Basically, that's like that. You got 5 spaces on the table and some remaining space that you could probably fit some other things. Most everybody gets this one correct. The next one was 919258. If you got that one, again, you're like most people. You get that one correct because it fits on the table. The next one was 9822931. 9822931. About half of students, subjects in the studies like this get this one right. And the reason for that is because 7 items is about the most that people can fit on their short-term memory table. Once it gets more than that, then the people that can fit those items on the table tend to be more rare and unique. 7 is about the average. So about half of students tend to get this whole string and half don't. The next one was 38549657. 38549657. There's usually a couple of people that get that one. The next one was 57047139. 57047139. And maybe one person gets that, often none. And then the last one was 5821961216. 5821961216. All right, so what's the capacity of short-term memory? On average, a guy named Miller, many years ago, found out that it was 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information, which basically means that on average, we can fit 7 different bits of information on that table at any one time. If your short-term memory capacity is on the poor side, maybe you can only do 5. If it's on the great side, it's more on, maybe you can do 9. Notice that that range is not very large. It turns out that when people have very good memories, it's usually not because their short-term memory table is longer. Most of us are pretty much stuck with this very short, limited, in terms of capacity, short-term memory table. Rather, where people excel in memories, it's usually when they have a better ability to find connections, to chunk things together, and see meaningful relationships so that things stick together a little more, and then they're more likely to be retained long term. So that gets us to the concept of chunking. I'm going to give you another memory test right here to see if you can chunk a whole bunch of letters in a meaningful way that you're able to recall a whole bunch of letters. So in this list I'm going to give you 15 letters. That's going to exceed the capacity of short-term memory. So unless you can chunk them in meaningful ways, you're likely not going to be able to remember them all. But there is a strategy to this, and I'll tell you after we go through it once. So let's see how you can do the first time through. So same rules. I'm going to read them off. When I get done, I'll say go, and then you write them down as many as you can remember. Okay, here we are. C, B, S, N, F, L, A, B, C, M, T, V, A, T, M, go. All right, again, you can pause this and see if you can get those. All right, there may have been some of you that got that because you could see that there's actually in the 15 letters, there's 5 meaningful chunks. The first 3, the second 3, the third 3, the fourth 3, and the fifth 3. And these are acronyms for things that you either do or you could use every day. So let's try it again with that in mind. See if you can take the first 3 and find something meaningful about them. And then the second 3, the third 3, the fourth 3, the fifth 3. And if you do that, basically what you got is, you got something like this, and the picture only shows 2 being stacked together. And I'm asking you to stack 3 at a time. But if you stack 2 together in a meaningful way, then you could remember 14 items. And if you stack 3 high, then you could remember 21 items. In this case, I'm only asking you to remember 15 in chunks of 3. So you should be able to get those. But anyway, let me read them to you again and see if you can find them, get them, remember them this time. C, B, S, N, F, L, A, B, C, M, T, V, A, T, M, go. All right. If you got them, it would be CBS, NFL, ABC, MTV, ATM. And if you think about that, it's pretty amazing that you can remember 15 items simply with a little bit of meaningful connection between them. I once heard, and more than once have read, that people who are mathematicians or musicians tend to have better short-term memories than other people. Now, again, they don't have longer tables or wider tables to fit more items on. Rather, what's happening with them is they see meaningful relationships in terms of numbers or musical notes that the rest of us don't. It's all about seeing patterns, seeing relationships that makes it more likely that understanding those is going to help you remember those things long term. All right. Now, something else about short-term memory is called the serial position effect. The serial position effect is a theory that describes what happens when let's say you're at a party and you're introduced to all these people and you want to try to remember all these people's names because it's going to be important for your social ability to belong and be accepted in the group, to remember their names. So you fill up your table with 7 people's names, and then you're introduced to an 8th person, and the table's full, so what's going to happen? Is that item going to be able to go on the table which would only happen if somehow there's some space vacated on the table for that item. Maybe what happens is that all these items slide over, and the first thing that first name, a person you were exposed to, that person's name gets dropped off the edge, which makes room, everything slides over, which makes room for this last name to go on the table. That's a possibility, or it could be a possibility that because the table is full, you just don't remember the 8th and the 9th and the 10th person that you met. Well, that's kind of unlikely, right? Still a possibility theoretically. A third possibility is that there's a hole in the middle of the table. So what happens is the first names, they're placed on the table, they kind of stick there. We call that having a primacy effect. There's a primacy effect that says that the first items that you put into short-term memory are more likely to stick. And then there's a recency effect that says the last items that you put on the table are most likely to stick, which basically means there's a hole in the middle of the table. All of these slide over, fall through that hole, and then new items are able to go on the table. If you were to graph it, it would look something like this. If you're introduced to a lot of people's names or you're studying a lot of information, the information you're studying in the middle of that period of time is least likely to be remembered in terms of your short-term memory. And what's mostly likely going to be remembered are the items you put first and the items you put last on the short-term memory table. So here's another test of memory. I'm just going to read off words this time, a lot of them, 20 words. See how many of them, when I get all done, that you're able to remember long-term or short-term. So when I get all done, I'll say go and write down as many as you can remember. House, cheese, star, pen, dish, book, highway, melon, horse, uncle, class, ocean, doorway, model, mustache, creature, cloud, prairie, train, plastic. Okay. How many of you remembered house? Everybody remembers house. That was the first item on the list, which basically means that there definitely is a primacy effect. It's the easiest word to remember on the whole list, the very first one. How many remembered plastic? Most people remember plastic as well. That was the last item on the list. So there's a recency effect as well. And how many remembered class? Fewer people remember class. Usually out of a class of 50 or 60 or 70 in my big Rave Hall classes, maybe only a few people, 5 or 6, remember class. Uncle, horse, ocean, those are right in the middle. Remembered a lot less likely than house and plastic. So again, the zero position effect seems to apply here. If you're studying for a test, the research suggests, based on this, that you should use shorter practice sessions and that you should do many more of them rather than have 3 or 4, actually 1 2 or 3 hour cram session. You should study for 20 minutes and then take a rest and then come back for another 20 minutes. Start roughly in the middle or 2/3 of the way through the material that you studied before. Start there and study for another 20 minutes. And then that way you have a shorter middle in each case. And with the overlap, you're putting the information in different spots of that curve. You're going to be better able to keep the stuff in your short-term memory longer, to be able to process it longer, to be able to consolidate it into the file cabinet of long-term memory. Okay, what about the duration of short-term memory? Back in the day when we didn't have phone numbers stored in our phones and we didn't have phones on us, you'd be driving down the street trying to find someplace and maybe you couldn't find it, so you go to a pay phone booth, look up the number of the place you're trying to go to so that you get directions. And as you're looking it up, you dial it, and then you close the book, and maybe if something goes wrong, maybe you misdialed it or something else went wrong, and so you need to dial it again. You usually have to look it back up again because your short-term memory duration is very short. most of us have had a lot of experience with the short duration of short-term memory. The fact is, it's not very long at all. The official duration of short-term memory is about 20 to 30 seconds without rehearsal, they say. So if you process something, pay attention to it, put it onto your short-term memory, and then don't process it any longer. If you're distracted by other things and you're not allowed to process, or you just don't process that thing you put on the table, anytime, at any point, at any time beyond first paying attention to it, it's likely going to go away in 20 to 30 seconds. So when I had my stroke and I was in rehab for 2 weeks after being in ICU for 8 days, they gave me all sorts of tests to see where my brain was at, both in terms of both physical function as well as memory and intellectual function. And one of the things that they did is they would say, hey, okay, here's a string of letters that we want you to remember, see if you can remember. But as soon as they showed me the letters or read to me the letters, they would say, okay, now before recalling it, what we want you to do now is count backwards from 100 by threes. So I would go, okay, 100, 97, 94, 91, 80, 88, 85, 82, 79, 76. And at some point they would say, okay, stop. Now tell us those letters or numbers that we told you before. And basically when you do that research, you find out even if you're not brain damaged, you have a hard time recalling to any significant degree those things that you're exposed to if the recall period is 20 to 30 seconds after being thoroughly distracted. So you can kind of see why cramming for a test, although I will readily acknowledge that some students have developed cramming for a test into a fine art and they do it quite well. But of course that's largely because maybe they don't really care that they remember the information long term. They only want to remember it long enough to be able to do well on the test. But still, cramming for a test, in a sense, is like trying to take the test out of short-term memory. And one of the reasons why it's an uphill battle to cram for the test and do well is because short-term memory has a very limited capacity and duration. It's hard to fit a lot of things on that table, for one thing, and it's hard to be able to hold on to them when you're taking other classes or you're doing other things that could interfere with the space on that table. And so things are going to start dropping off. When I used to give short quizzes in class, it always frustrated me when I had a quiz at the end of the class period, that while I'm lecturing in the 30 minutes prior to the test quiz, that students were too busy looking over their notes from the previous weeks and looking at the book and cramming when I know that I'm telling them information that's going to be on the quiz, but they're not paying attention to me because I would be a distraction. They're trying to fit as much as they can onto this limited space and not be distracted. And I'm thinking in my mind, look, if you pay more attention to me, I'm probably going to help you do better on the quiz, but they're too busy cramming and not paying attention. So anyway, that used to frustrate the heck out of me. Ideally, when you take a test, you're going to take it out of long-term memory. If you put it into long-term memory, keep it there, then chances are you're going to do better on the test because it has far more sticking power. So just take a look at these two images. That's really hard to see. It's a little better. Okay. Doesn't this image here kind of look like a trombone player? He slid the trombone slide out and then the door shut on it. The door shuts on it, and so the end of the slide is hanging out. It kind of looks like that, right? Okay, and I'm going to take that picture away. As I said a moment ago, long-term memory is where you want to put things to be able to keep them long-term, even if you're not rehearsing them, and even if you have a whole lot of distractions, and if you have a lot of things you're trying to remember. Long-term memory is where you want to put things in order to be able to recall them after some time. Now, we said before that what determines whether things move from sensory memory to short-term memory is attention. That's a level of processing. So you're moving out the x-axis if you're paying attention to something. If you pay attention more and process it in a meaningful way, then you're going to move it from short-term memory to long-term memory. We call that rehearsal. So attention moves things from sensory memory to short-term memory, and rehearsal moves things from short-term memory to long-term memory. Rehearsal is just more attention, more meaningful attention. There's two broad types of rehearsal. The first type of rehearsal is called maintenance rehearsal. Maintenance rehearsal represents pure repetition. So you try to remember something, so you just repeat it in your mind as if you were trying to beat a pathway in your mind to make it kind of indelibly etched in your mind. You're trying to remember the goals of psychology, so you go describe, predict, explain, control, describe, predict, explain, control, describe, predict, explain, control. That's maintenance rehearsal. Another way to remember, describe, predict, explain, control is to use a elaborative rehearsal, which is attaching meaning. So if you learn that describe, predict, explain, control has within it some sort of a debate as to whether it's easier to explain than predict or vice versa, whether it's more basic to explain than predict. And if you then think about it also in terms of DPEC or DEP-C, as we talked about early in the semester, then you're attaching meaning to those four goals of psychology, and you're better able to remember them. So when I went over those things in that way early in the semester, it was to provide you some elaborative rehearsal strategy to remember those goals, as well as to make you think and help you develop deeper understanding of psychology in general. In fact, if you think about most of the things we've talked about this semester, the stories, the anecdotes, the explanations, the debates, the controversies, those are all elaborative rehearsal strategies to get you to attach meaning to these things so you're better able to remember them. So with that in mind, let's go back to these images that I showed you a little bit ago. There were two line drawings. Maybe you couldn't see them. Maybe you wouldn't be able to do this at all, but I'll just talk you through it anyway. See if you can draw them both on your piece of paper, if you were able to see them on the screen. See if you can draw them both. And then see which one you're able to draw better than the other one. Did one of them get drawn better than the other one? So here's the images. I gave you an elaborative rehearsal strategy to remember this image. I didn't give you one for that one. This one you're more likely to have drawn better because of the strategy I gave you. This one, if you drew it better, maybe it's because you could see it better on the screen. Or maybe it's because you developed your own elaborative rehearsal strategy to remember it. A chicken falling down a manhole, or a chicken in the dryer going around and around and around. In fact, it is mnemonic memory strategies and things like that tend to help us remember things. Those are elaborative rehearsal strategies. Once, many years ago, my 6th, 7th, 8th grade daughter asked me if I knew the colors of the visible spectrum or the colors of the rainbow. And when she asked me initially, I thought, heck no, I don't remember that. That was something I learned when I was your age, and it's not important, so I don't remember that anymore at all. And then all of a sudden, Roy G. Biv came to me, and I thought, oh, wow, I do know the colors of the visible spectrum: red, orange, yellow, blue, green, indigo, violet, because of that mnemonic I learned many, many years ago. Every good boy does fine. The notes on the treble clef face, the notes in the spaces on the treble clef, and then all cows eat grass, and good boys do fine always, or something like that. SOHCAHTOA, PEMDAS, all those things are elaborative rehearsal strategies. They simply work. And I actually think that if you're constantly thinking of those kind of strategies to remember things long term, there's probably something wrong with you again. You're probably kind of quirky, weird. But the strategies work because that's how long-term memory works. It works on the basis of meaning. The more you understand things, the more you're likely to be able to remember them long-term. Now, long-term memory is not just one file cabinet of information. It's a whole hierarchy of file cabinets, and memories get placed, categorized according to where they fit in that hierarchy. That's what allows them to remember them, is because they're placed in our brain hierarchically and structurally in a way that makes sense. That leads to the understanding that there's two broad types of long-term memories: explicit memories and implicit memories. Explicit memories also can be called conscious memories, and sometimes are called declarative memories. Conscious memories because these are the memories that we have to be conscious of in order to be able to use. Like that information on the test, you can't just file it away into long-term memory storage and then expect to have it be useful on the test. If you can't bring it back from long-term memory into the short-term memory of consciousness, you're not going to be able to do well on the test. So explicit memories really definitely follow the three-stage model of memory: 1, 2, 3, and then back to 2 again. In terms of the declarative label, declarative memory basically means that in order to be able to use these memories, you have to be able to declare them in your mind, which basically means you have to be able to think about them. There's two broad types of episodic memories: semantic memory, which are memories for facts and information, and then there's episodic memory, which are memories for the events of your life. Your autobiographical memory is your memory that allows you to recall what you did yesterday, what you ate for breakfast yesterday, and other details of yesterday, but also what you did when you were 5 and the day this happened in your life, the day you first went to Disneyland, or things like that. It turns out that the worst memory that people have is episodic memory. Then you have implicit memories. Implicit memories have two broad types. Procedural memories are muscle memories, memories that you just kind of unconsciously do because they're kind of second nature to you, learning how to ride a bike, or being able to ride a bike, or play the piano, or drive a stick shift. Those are procedural memories that once you get them, you kind of really don't forget them. They stick with you very, 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 very long time. And then there are conditioned memories. Conditioned memories are memories like, for me, the blueberry muffin memory, that even though I understand that I like blueberries and muffins, and the reason why I don't like blueberry muffins is because of the flu, I just have this kind of instinct, in a sense, now that causes me to dislike blueberry muffins. It's kind of been deeply instilled in me because of that experience a long, long time ago. That was classically conditioned. So kind of your gut reaction to things that just seems to exist in spite of thinking and reasoning, that mind of its own kind of a thing, part of us. Those kind of memories are also implicit memories. So we call implicit memories non-conscious or unconscious memories, and we call them non-declarative memories. You don't have to declare them in your brain, in your mind, to be able to use them. So there's a little link to a YouTube video in the PowerPoint you'll see in Canvas, and that's a description or a little story that shows the life of Jill Price. Jill Price is a woman, it's hard for me to believe, but she claims, and there's some research done on here that suggests that it's correct, that she actually has an autobiographical memory, an episodic memory for the events of her life that just never ends. She remembers everything that ever happened to her, everything in her life. She's highly unusual. She probably has some sort of brain anomaly that makes that possible for her, but it's a huge distraction for her, and it creates all sorts of problems. For most of us, episodic memory is the worst. The next slide here takes you to the video about Clive Wearing. I talked to you about Clive Wearing earlier in the semester. This is a guy who had encephalitis, and it destroyed his hippocampus. And essentially what that did to him is it caused him not to be able to remember any of his explicit memories. He couldn't remember facts and information in his life, what the date was today is today. He couldn't remember the Prime Minister of England, the Queen of England. He couldn't remember all those kind of factual things, but he also couldn't remember ever having married his wife or any experience his wife and he had ever shared. But what he retained was his implicit memories that were based on his procedural memory, or that involved his procedural memory, and also that involved his conditioned memory. So he knew how to play the piano and conduct music. He was a famous, actually, conductor of a London symphony. And he still retained those abilities, even though he couldn't remember that he had those abilities. In the video, you'll see him walking into a little get-together with some of his old friends in the symphony. And his wife is trying to tell him that he could play the piano, and he plays very, very well. And he says, I don't know, I've never played before. And then he sits down and he plays like the master he is. That's procedural memory. And then the video also depicts his wife coming into the room, and he kisses and hugs her and says that he loves her. And then she says something like, well, do you kiss all women like this? No, it's only you. You're the woman I love. And so in the video, it shows him a couple of times showering kisses and attention on his wife. And he does that every time she walks in the door, even if it was 5 minutes previously. And he says every time, this is the first time I've ever seen you. He doesn't remember previous events, but what he does remember is the fact that he loves his wife and that she's somehow somebody special to him. Kind of a weird existence. He has to live in an institution. And it's led him to not even know, if you research him a little further, not even know that somewhere along the line his wife divorced him and moved from England to New York City, lived there for a little while, realized that she still loved him, went back and remarried him. Anyway, it turns out that the hippocampus is highly important in the event memories of our life, episodic memories, conscious memories, explicit memories, not important in procedural memories and conditioned memories, which are part of implicit memories. Okay, so let's talk about the question of duration and capacity. So the duration of sensory memory is pretty short. The capacity is huge. The duration of short-term memory is pretty short. The capacity is also very limited. So what about the capacity of long-term memory? Well, you probably know that it's unlimited. We would say that there's no limit to how much you can put into your long-term memory storage. But still, the question, kind of a philosophical question, exists. Is it really unlimited because it's so large you can never fill it? Or is it truly, truly unlimited in that there's really no walls, no end to it at all? It would be like having this kind of a question. Do you have a hard drive that stores memories and long-term memory that's like having 10 trillion terabytes of space? Or is it like having an infinity terabyte amount of space in your hard drive of long-term memory? You may think that that's an unsolvable question, but psychologists do believe that they've been able to answer the question, and the answer is that it's not so large that you can't fill it. It's infinitely large. It just goes on forever and ever. It has an infinity terabyte hard drive up there. The reason for that is because we don't actually store memory. So Elizabeth Loftus is very famous for pointing out that when we recall a memory, we simply just reconstruct the electrochemical events that occurred when we experienced that memory in the first place. In between, we're not actually storing that memory in any place. If memories aren't stored any place, They're not taking up space, and therefore there's no limit at all. And another way to think about it is, okay, yeah, we have a finite number of neurons in our brain. It is a very large number, but it's finite, right? But even if you have 26 letters of the English alphabet, a finite and very small number of letters, there is an infinite number of ways, and some of you would argue against this, but I could argue against you. There's an infinite number of ways that 26 letters of the English alphabet can be put together to form an infinite number of poems and essays and dissertations and conversations, and an infinite number of words. A little bit more on Elizabeth Loftus. She did research that went something like this to show us that we reconstruct memories, that we don't store copies of memories that take up space. So what she would do is she would show subjects a videotape of a car accident. It wasn't too dramatic, no real major damage, a little fender bender, no glass on the road, not a high impact accident. She would then ask subjects how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. Just ask them a simple question. But other subjects were asked a similar question, except it wasn't with the word smashed in it. The question had the word hit in it, rather than smashed. So how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other versus how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? What she found out was that those who heard the word smashed in this question, later on when they were asked how much glass was on the road, they said there was a lot of glass. Those who heard the word hit in the question, when they were later on asked how much glass was on the road, they didn't remember seeing much glass. They said there wasn't much glass on the road at all. And also, those who heard the word with the question smashed in it thought the cars were going faster, remembered the cars going faster than those who heard the question with the word hit in it. They thought the cars were going slower. So, again, these people who heard this question with the word smashed in it remembered a more dramatic accident, and they remembered seeing glass on the road. So she was able to change people's memories simply by changing the wording of a question that she gave them, which suggests to her and many others that we don't store memories. They're just reconstructed every time. In fact, you could look at it this way as well. Those neurons that are used to process a certain memory and then are used again when you recall that memory later, those neurons are not somehow locked up so that they can't be used for anything else in between. If that were the case, the longer we live, the more likely our brain would become totally paralyzed because everything is locked up with memories. That's not the way it is, right? Which again further substantiates to most researchers that there are no limits to how much memory can fit into long-term memory. Now, what's the duration of long-term memories? We would say it's a lifetime. They can last forever, but they are subject to like decay of that memory trace, memory pathway in the brain. That can happen biologically over time, but it can also happen through interference, where something interferes with something else, and it can also happen because you're not rehearsing something well enough or long enough. So if you don't rehearse something well enough or long enough, you're more likely to have that memory trace decay and disappear over time. And if you have memories that interact with other memories and get in each other's way, then your memories can be lost and potentially not last a lifetime, even though they could last a lifetime if that lack of rehearsal and that interference didn't exist. So just to talk about interference a little bit, there's two types of interference. There's retroactive interference and proactive interference. Retroactive interference is like this. If I have a hard time remembering the students that I had last semester because of you students I have this semester, then your names are going backwards in time and interfering with my ability to recall their names. That's retroactive interference. At the same time, I may have a hard time remembering your names at the beginning of this semester because of the names of students last semester getting in the way of my ability to recall your names. That would be proactive interference, where their names are going forward in time from the fall semester to the spring semester to interfere with your names, the recall of your names. So if you've ever called your current boyfriend or girlfriend by an old one, that would be proactive interference and a huge mistake. Be careful. All right, take a look at this. Huge capacity of sensory register memory. We only pay attention to a very small percentage of all those things that get placed into our sensory systems. And so we're only potentially able to remember a very small amount of what we initially experienced when we get to short-term memory. When we get to long-term memory, not everything moves from short-term memory to long-term memory because of the lack of rehearsal or lack of effective rehearsal. And then when we get to retrieval, very little of what we initially experienced we're able to remember because of interference, because of memory decay, because of lack of repetition, lack of rehearsal, and so on. So we remember in the end very little of what we initially experienced, which suggests that our memories are really pretty poor. It's just that they're made so that, or they've evolved to be such that what we do remember are the things that are most important to remember. So this is the most important of all this stuff, but it's really a very small percentage of all this stuff. Okay, a couple of questions. Flashbulb memories, which we talked about early in the chapter, where do they arise? What type of a flashbulb memory, what type of a memory is a flashbulb memory? The answer to that is flashbulb memories are long-term memories. Put in other words, flashbulb memories are episodic memories, which normally are not remembered very well, but because they're highly meaningful, we process them to a great degree, and so they stick for a long time. Those are long-term memories. Eidetic memories, photographic memories, according to the description I gave you in the lecture today, eidetic memories, what stage do they belong in? Well, they're sensory register memories. Remember, they are especially long, iconic memories. Rather than a half a second, they could be several seconds or a few minutes, and then they typically go away. And remember, they don't help you long-term. They don't help your long-term memory. They're simply extra long, iconic memories. And then lastly, whatever you're thinking about right now, which might be, I'm glad this video is just about over, whatever you're thinking about right now is in your short-term memory. Short-term memory is consciousness. It's what allows you to process information right now, either because you just sensed it and put it on that table, or because something that's on the table triggered you to pull something out of your long-term memory file cabinet and to put on the table to be able to think about that. All right, hope that went okay. Sorry about the pale, not very visible PowerPoint, but hopefully you can figure out a way to put this together with you're looking at the PowerPoint, and maybe it works out for you. Hope you have a good week, and I'll see you next week. Bye.